Although Nissan made a lot of interesting cars, it has to be said that none of them did as much for the brand's image as the sporty models that have come out of Japanese engineers' hands over the years, mostly because usually they were simply brilliant. After all, it was the Z-series cars that helped convince customers to the brand in the States and other markets, and following versions of Silvia models raised a couple of generations of drifters, to say the least. But the most exciting cars from decades were actually kept hidden by Nissan from the rest of the world. We are of course talking about the GT-R series, which today, rightfully so, enjoys cult status, with one exception. The history of the Skyline dates back to the late 50s and, perhaps surprisingly for some, initially had nothing to do with either sports or Nissan. The first Skyline was a typical luxury sedan, the development of which was the responsibility of Fuji Precision Industries, later renamed for Prince Motor Company. 2 years after production started, a stylish coupe was introduced, designed by the Italian master Michelotti. After the second generation of the model was presented, the company was doing alright, but nevertheless in the mid-60s was absorbed by the rapidly expanding Nissan. They sensibly took under their wing not only the Skyline, but also somewhat based on it larger Gloria line. That almost effortlessly gained them access to coveted upper class segments, putting Nissan on par with the biggest players in the Japanese market. A few years later, the first and, for me, the prettiest of all GT-Rs was introduced, today mostly known by the nickname Hakosuka. Interestingly, the car in its highest trim was available both as a sedan and coupe, but it was the latter version that became most famous. The factory racing team was famously represented by a trio of legendary Japanese drivers: Kunimitsu, Kurosawa and Kitano. Kunimitsu was particularly popular among fans because of his spectacular driving style. In fact, his unique ability to drive a car at high speeds in controlled slides later inspired young Keiichi Tsuchiya, who certainly needs no introduction to any drifting fans out there. Unfortunately, this car's successor, the Kenmeri, hit the market at the height of fuel crisis and disappeared after only 198 of them were produced. The decision to withdraw the car was certainly not an easy one, but from company point of view as a whole it was most justified. And although the next incarnation of Skyline models always spawn a fast version, the distinctive GT-R logo did not appear in any of them for the next 16 years, until the R32 debut. When Nissan decided to resurrect the legendary moniker in 1989, it was simply in order to humiliate Ford and its all-conquering Sierra and, incidentally, any other manufacturer that thought it could mean something in a world of Group A racing. Therefore, the R32 GT-R was intended to be nothing more than a pure homologation special, so the initial plan was to build the 5000 required by the rules and then simply focus on collecting trophies. Given that, the model's astonishing motorsport success was no surprise, but the fact that orders for road-going cars were almost constantly pouring in certainly was. In the end, nearly 44 brand new GT-Rs were put on the road over the next 5 years. Considering the high performance pedigree of the car and, after all, the high purchase price, that was truly a remarkable result. Even more so when we keep in mind that Godzilla was officially offered only in Japan and debuted near the start of gigantic recession in the Japanese economy. Nissan's management did not need to be particularly persuaded to create a successor, which was again meant to be icing on the cake for the new 9th generation model, which, above all, has grown a lot, influenced of course by changing regulations, customer taste and general evolution of the model. The advertising praised the new Skyline as more comfortable, safer, better made and more technologically advanced. So, just like every other new incarnation of any car since the beginning of automotive history. You can certainly see this progression in the design, which, in line with the trends of the time, incorporates a lot of more curves. But it has to be said that relative to its predecessor, from some angles it looks as if it has somewhat forgotten its New Year's resolutions while passing a nearby fast food restaurant. In the case of top-of-the-range GT-R, the changes have been even more radical, and for their direction the model can thank first and foremost its predecessor. The R32 was so dominant on the track that many racing series were forced to modify their regulations just to prevent formation of unofficial Skyline Cups in the future, as was the case for a couple of seasons of the Japanese JGTC. Somewhat following the example set by the BMW M3, the GT-R from now on became a road car adapted to racing, rather than the other way around. The R33 therefore had to redefine itself in insanely strong GT class, and so, in addition to its homegrown competitors like the Supra, 3000 GT and NSX, it was throwing a challenge against the 911 and whatever Ferrari offered. Ambitious, but the success of its predecessor certainly led to this kind of optimism. A prototype of the car was unveiled shortly after the debut of the new generation in September '93, but it went on sale almost 2 years later. This relative lack of rush became both an advantage and, in a way, a curse for the new car. It was decided that everything that worked well in the R32 had to be kept, so the focus was on working on those elements where the predecessor showed some weaknesses. So the excellent RB26 DETT inline 6-cylinder engine remained on board, again backed by 2 ceramic turbochargers. The power plant was slightly improved for flexibility and was accompanied by latest, noticeably more efficient and stable, computer-controlled version of the Super Highcas, as well as the company's 4x4 Atessa ETS system working with a limited slip differential. A great deal of time was devoted to increasing rigidity of the bodywork by further reinforcing, among other things, the structure of the B-pillars and seals. Also, for better weight distribution, the battery was moved to the boot. The handling characteristics of GT-R were also improved considerably due to changes made to front suspension and fitting of larger 17-inch wheels. Customers could also choose a sharper V-spec version, available right from the start of production, which, in addition to firmer shocks and springs, received a brand new Atessa ETS Pro drivetrain, this time supported by an active differential. As a result of all of these changes, the car gained an extra 100 kg, but considering the scale of the modification, this is not a bad figure. And if it still wasn't enough, you could opt for the almost ready to race N1 version, stripped of all unnecessary luxuries. I must admit that I've always had a problem with the design of the R33, it somehow just does not work for me as much. While the car certainly looked more mature than before, there was no denying that its competitors were able to flex their muscle a little bit more subtly. In comparison, the GT-R is clearly more flashy and has more of a tuner vibe in character. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad thing at all, but I just prefer the sharper R32. The most striking feature has to be the very aggressive front bumper with large air intakes. The fierce aura is complemented with the strongly marked fender and seal extensions, as well as larger than before, adjustable spoiler on the back. Unfortunately, things aren't quite as good inside. It is just another example of generic Japanese car interiors from 1990s. A few typical touches in the form of bucket seats and a few extra gauges can't hide the fact that it is simply boring. But that's a good thing too, because driving this car fast certainly requires a lot of concentration. On paper, the performance was almost unchanged. New Skyline needed around 5.6 seconds to get to 100 km/h. This means in the drag race the top-of-the-range Nissan could be slightly behind its competitors, even the likes of the smaller but similarly powerful super sedans like Impreza and Lancer Evo. But dry numbers don't do this car justice, because it showed its greatest value in the corners. It's worth mentioning that was the time when manufacturers began to take the results of the test taken on the famous Nordschleife a bit more seriously, because marketing departments were slowly coming to grips with the fact that a good time achieved in the green hell looks good in advertising brochures. Nissan sent a brand new V-spec GT-R straight to Germany with the aforementioned Mr. Kurosawa as a driver. Do you know how much faster the car went through the lap compared to its predecessor? About 20 seconds. That's massive, especially on such a demanding track, and keep in mind that on paper both cars have virtually identical power. In further tests, the R33 managed to become the first production car to break the 8-minute barrier on this iconic track, beating the rivals from Zuffenhausen on their home turf. Nevertheless, when the car finally hit the roads, there was no denying that the 280 horsepower written in the catalogue no longer sounded as good as it had a few years earlier. Sure, everyone was well aware of the potential of this machine and, thanks to the experience gained from its predecessor, knew how to easily extract it, but not everyone wants to immediately tinker with a pricey sports coupe they just bought. Of course, the deliberate limiting of power was a result of famous gentleman's agreement made by Japanese manufacturers in the late 1980s, except that less than a decade later it was a bit like driving with the handbrake on. In fact, all Japanese cars squeezed out little more power than manufacturers claimed, but there's nothing like a good publicity stunt, which Nissan was soon to break out in rather spectacular fashion. But before that happened, the Skyline once again had a chance to test its capabilities on the track, this time in completely different conditions. For Nissan, as for the rest of Japanese car makers, the French long-distance classic held at the Circuit de la Sarthe is the proverbial holy grail. Particularly in late 80s and early 90s, during the reign of the mighty Group C, the track was swarming with Japanese machines, but only Mazda managed to famously win in 91, and shortly afterwards the famous category became a thing of the past. At the time it was considered far too expensive and dangerous, and a change to the current status quo was viewed as a necessary step forward. However, the rules were full of loopholes, which resulted in that the potentially lower GT1 category, intended to be based on road-going cars, for a few years easily dominated over the prototypes. Just think about the circus surrounding the performance of the Porsche aka Dauer 962 in 94 and the later self-conscious efforts of McLaren, Mercedes and Porsche once again. Besides, how could it have been otherwise when the rules, unlike in any other series, really did not specify how many such cars had to be made? At least one. That's it. So, not surprisingly, Nissan followed the rest of the pack and used what it had at hand. This way the Skyline GT-R LM was born, which is also the most hardcore GT-R ever. Aside from extensively rebuilt, drastically widened bodywork, the biggest changes were to be found underneath. Due to requirements of the GT1 series, the famous Atessa system had to be removed, making it the last rear-wheel drive GT-R. The one-off road-going version was never intended for sale and for obvious reasons is currently kept under a blanket in Nissan's warehouses and is consequently extremely rarely seen, which is a shame. Its brothers made it to the track but unfortunately performed rather mediocrely there. The debut at Le Mans took place in 95 and one of the cars finished in a respectable 10th position overall, although it is worth to mention that two weaker GT2 class cars finished ahead of it, including what surely must have been very painful for Nissan, the Honda NSX. After two rather disappointing attempts, the GT-R was essentially replaced by the R390, which later in 98 battled with BMW for the win, at the end taking the other two podium places. The Skyline in a similar specification had a much better run in its home JGTC series, where it managed to win the series championship twice in 95 and 98. It also looked insane in the Pennzoil team livery, which is always a big plus for me. Meanwhile, between 96 and 97, the most powerful and rarest road-going Skyline of this generation was created as a tribute to cars trying their hand at Le Mans. The good news was that, for a change, it could be bought. It was named 400R and it became famous above all for being the first Japanese car to officially boast more than the usual 280 horsepower. Nismo was responsible for the preparation of the car and it has to be said that they've done a really good job. Under the bonnet, an interesting development of an existing engine can be found, this time with mysterious RBX GT2 designation written on valve cover. This was essentially a custom-built, high-performance motor made by an external company. It was bored and stroked, which increased displacement to 2.8 liters and, as the name rightly suggests, is developed respectable 400 horses. It also revved up to 9000 RPM, so practically 1000 more than in the standard model. Additionally, it received completely different gearbox, which was supplied by Getrack, and thanks to further work on suspension, the car was lowered by 3 cm and set up in mind to reduce understeer that affected other variants. On the outside there were relatively few changes, the most striking being a sticker running from the front wings along the entire length of the car with 400R lettering at the end. New car needed only 4 seconds to get to 100 k's and accelerated to almost 300, which at the time put it at the top of the fastest GT-Rs ever. Although the original plan was to build 100 cars, only about 40 were completed, so it's not at all surprising that this is another treat reserved mainly for the wealthiest collectors. Between 95 and 98, nearly 17,000 units of the R33 hit the roads. This is considerably less than was managed by its predecessor, but it's no surprise, since its market life was also shorter than in the case of R32. In pop culture, the model made its mark mainly through its famous presence in the first Gran Turismo series games. It also got a shot in the Fast and Furious franchise, but it's not as strongly associated with this series as its successor, the R34. To be honest, there is so much more to be said about the R33. After all, I haven't even mentioned the car offered by Middlehurst in the UK yet, or the 4-door sedan prepared by Otech, which was also really interesting. I'll honestly admit that, although my heart definitely beat fastest for the first Hakosuka and of course the brutal Godzilla, the R33 is placed right behind them in my personal ranking. For me, it is just the most groundbreaking Skyline ever made. Sure, it didn't stand on the podium as many times as the rest of its siblings, but the way it successfully combined the Group A nature of its predecessor with the technological flair of the mid-90s deserves a lot of credit. Of course, not all of the experiments worked out as planned, but the experience gained through them was a great lesson in the development of the successor. And its influence can be clearly seen in the R35 presented almost a decade later, which still impresses despite being 15 years old. So the next time you will come across the R33 Skyline, don't think of it as a black sheep, because it really doesn't deserve that. Thanks for your attention and I hope to see you soon.